Thank you. And thank you so much, Bart, for organizing this and inviting me. And it's been a great couple of days, and I've just really enjoyed all the talks so much, which puts me in the luxurious position of not having to do anything because it's really all been done, but puts me in a slightly awkward position of being very fearful of repeating. So what I'm going to do today might seem like a rather large stalling tactic, a resistance to actually getting down to the topic of Hegel and resistance. But my gamble is that this might be one way of putting resistance to work in Hegel by approaching it somewhat indirectly. And my basic question will have to do with what the possible relevance of psychoanalysis can be for understanding Hegel, specifically, how the major tropes of psychoanalysis, negativity, resistance, and work, might relate to their homonyms in Hegel, or might help us ask new questions about them. So there's three parts to this paper. The first one is called Resistance and Stathis. There's an antinomy implicit in the word itself. Resistance signals both impediment and impetus. It can either disrupt or sustain the equilibrium and steadiness of every situation, state of affairs, or setup, either a force of transformation or a bulwark against innovation, either conservative or transformative, and at times disconcertingly both at once. Resistance shares many of the semantic tensions of its close cognate, stasis, with its contradictory senses of immobility and upheaval. Stasis in Greek has the ambiguity or ambivalence relating to all things standing. Both resistance and stasis derive from the Greek histeme, from which the Latin stare, sistera, and so on. A verb that pivots on the grammatical tension between its stative and active uses, between the condition of standing and the act of standing up, between continuum and event. So, steadfastness, constancy, and stability on the one hand, interruption, instigation, initiation on the other. It points to that which is stationary, static, persists, stands up over time, withstands the corrosive and erosive forces of antagonism and entropy, is consecrated to status, consistency and standing. For example, the erection of a statue, the establishment of an institution, legal statute, and sovereign state. It is actually the very meaning of a sovereign state that it wants to and needs to perpetuate itself. But it also gestures to that which insists, takes a stand, stands apart or against, stands up to or rises up against the existing state of affairs, defies the status quo, desists from consensus, dismantles statues and institutions, disregards or defies laws and constitutions, introduces dissent, division, discord into the stable order of the state itself. Stasis, or stasis, means steadiness, constancy, permanence, and it also means, in Greek, sedition, faction, rebellion, civil war. Aristotle uses the word in both senses. In the metaphysics, stasis pertains to the immobility of the unmoved mover, the stability of the celestial bodies, and in the politics, to political upheaval, constitutional transformation, civil strife. There's an internal stasis or dissensus in the very meaning of stasis. Nicole Leroux, who's done more than anyone to explore this antinomy, speaks of what she calls a Gegensinn, alluding to those primal words that Freud loved to draw on when demonstrating the imperviousness of the unconscious to the laws of non-contradiction. Barbara Cassin finds the word, in her words, Freudian, Hegelian, which raises the stakes. It resembles those special words that Hegel liked stumbling on in his own mother tongue, words famously like Aufhebung, with its antithetical range of meanings, and that he took as evidence of the inextinguishable pulsation or negativity of thought and being. Stathis forces us to reconsider the opposition of motion and rest, stability and change, unity and plurality, identity and difference. It puts the very antithesis of stasis and kinesis into crisis. Too much stability can be destabilizing, while excessive mobility produces deadlock. In medical register, stasis refers to digestive sluggishness, circulatory constriction, gastric blockage, constipation, the toxic coagulation or clogging of bodily humors, a stagnation that will eventually throw the whole organism into crisis, which is another way of thinking how stuckness can produce upheaval. In a political register, stasis can be a kind of hardening or rigidity that can precipitate catastrophic change precisely because, in its obduracy, its one-sidedness, its refusal to adapt to circumstances, to go with the flow, it exposes the rigid armature sustaining the status quo, provoking counter-reactions and forcing latent antagonisms to the surface. Conversely, too much agitation can be immobilizing. Alcaeus speaks of a stasis of the winds, as when a ship, a sailing vessel or a ship of state, is caught between countervailing gusts, waves buffeting it from side to side, marooned in constant motion, as if in irons or as if becalmed. We are at sea when too much turbulence becomes confining, when we're immobilized by internal conflict or trapped in the endless vortex of opposing forces. This also happens, or can happen, in a political and historical register when protracted conflict produces oppositional gridlock, when too much movement or the wrong kind of movement ends up reducing time and history itself to the endless reproduction of the same. The stalemate of prolonged civil war, the repetitive circle of revenge, and so on. This historical paralysis can leave as its own aftermath yet another blockage, the traumatic persistence of a past that will not pass, but which lingers on as a stony impediment, arresting thought and action. This is why stasis for the Greeks, the civil war at Athens, for example, when the unified city found itself convulsed by internal dissension, at once paralyzed by strife and spinning out of control, simultaneously agitated and frozen, why stasis poses such a problem for the reestablishment of subsequent rule and the return to history. Nothing short of enforced amnesia could break the traumatic hold of the past and suspend the deadlock of inter- and transgenerational violence. This took a strange form, mandated forgetfulness, the paradoxical injunction not to remember, me mnemistic kakain, to take actually an oath, committing oneself not to remember, that is, to remember not to remember, or rather to remember to not remember, the official oblivion decreed by the law of amnesty of 403 BCE, and which will be the template for subsequent amnesties from the Treaty of Westphalia to the post-war French legislation forbidding prosecution or even naming collaborators in the Vichy regime. But amnesty is itself a kind of freeze, a freeze repeating a previous freeze, stasis supervening upon a previous stasis. Everything is arrested, everything starts up again. Motion is restored but only by a kind of deep freeze, as if everything has been surgelé, super frozen, like those supermarket products in France, a standstill which interrupts stagnation by compounding or redoubling it. Resistance is another kind of primal word in just this sense. An oppositional and repetitive stance and standing. There's an again lurking in the against, a vita with an E lurking in the vita. Resistance straddles the line awkwardly between persistence and insistence. It points at once to a kind of seeming conservatism, reluctance, inertia, and even paralysis, and to a restlessness that wants to push every situation to breaking point and to leave nothing standing. The point is not that resistance lacks political motivation or direction, although it's notable that though we tend these days to think of resistance as a good thing, progressive, courageous, on the side of liberty and justice, we might well remember, since we're here at least, that some of its earliest expressions tilted decidedly towards the right. I'm thinking of Edmund Burke. But there's an essential undecidability in the notion that makes resistance awkward as an unequivocal political resource. Everyone wants to claim it, and everyone wants to deflate it. And this is, I think, significant. The difficult historical issues. One need look no further than to the mother of all resistances, the movement that claimed the name as its very own, the resistance, la résistance, to think about this a bit. The point is not only that the extent of that resistance turned out to have been a little bit, let's say, woefully exaggerated, that like almost any other political event, it had been quickly overtaken by myth and fantasy, that the sharp dividing line between resistance and collaboration turned out to be at times uncomfortably blurring. This is the so-called Vichy Syndrome that kind of shook everyone in the 1970s. But also that the resistance itself was fraught with political tensions from the outset, and that its legacy was ambiguous and divided. The patriotic sentiments inflamed in the French resistance to the German occupation would be harnessed by de Gaulle almost immediately after the war to sustain France's own war of colonial aggression in Algeria, a violence that would, of course, provoke the Algerian War of Independence, which would in turn draw on the legacy of the French Revolution, and which would display its own vicissitudes and repetitive violence. But the issue is not simply historical. There's a conceptual one that I'm trying to move around. It's become a little routine to disparage resistance, to doubt its efficacy, or to deplore its reactive and even reactionary aspects. This deflationary project can sometimes be an exercise in one-upmanship, as can, of course, calling it one-upmanship, like I'm just doing. A cursory reading, at least a cursory reading, I say hedging, of Adorno, Foucault, Agamben, or Arendt, Hart, Negri, on some days Zizek, might suggest that resistance is futile, that it's co-opted in advance or toxically contaminated by what it opposes, that it's a byproduct, an accomplice of power that has been snuffed out by the forces of total domination, ensnared in the web of administration, smothered by this thing called empire, or absorbed by the machinery of global capitalism. The gist of these diverse arguments, though they're not the same, but the gist is that all power needs resistance. Every regime requires for its own maintenance a steady supply of recalcitrant negativity that it can absorb or overcome. capitalism's need for crisis, liberal democracy's need for at least a show of contestation, if only to confirm the resilience of the system or to deflect more vigorous forms of opposition. That's what freedom of speech is good for. The totalitarian need for a reliable supply of dissidents that it can visibly suppress by a show of force as an object lesson. Resistance is thus, and I'm still speaking in free and direct discourse of these representations of resistance. Resistance is thus parasitical on what it opposes. It's caught up in the cycle of action and reaction, the circle of reciprocal solicitation described by Hegel in Force and the Understanding and explicated in the Logic of Essence. Or, to speak in a Lacanian Nietzschean register, resistance is frozen in the imaginary, mesmerized by the mirror play of endless mimetic doubling. It's condemned to reactivity and ressentiment. In its desire to challenge existing conditions, but without the means or will to overcome them, resistance is committed to reproducing these conditions, borrowing its tactics and ideals from extant models. Either every image of the future is forged in the crucible of the present, the Marxist argument against utopian socialism, or, which amounts to the same thing, there can be no vision of the future, not even the aspiration to have a future, because the activity of resistance itself has become self-fulfilling, dedicated solely and therefore formally to its own continuation. This is at least part of the Marxist argument against anarchism. You get so captivated by the struggle that you never want it to end. This also happens to be Hegel's critique of abstract negation. The problem is not that it's too radical, but that it's ultimately reactionary. Like all skepticism of the non-thoroughgoing kind, it invests everything in its own powers of contestation, thus obscuring its own reliance on the status quo. In short, the negativity of resistance is either too determinate or too abstract, or rather, its determinacy itself is an abstraction. Determinate negation is reduced to the rigid binary of opposition and reversal. This ambiguity can account for the friction that sometimes arises when emancipatory political projects, feminism or anti-colonialism, for example, come into contact with projects like psychoanalysis. That is, when a progressive definition of resistance as a tactic of insubordination clashes with what seems to be a regressive and repressive definition of resistance as a strategy of subjugation. The problem is it can be hard to see whether resistance is a struggle against or a collusion with the existent. It can be either a challenge to oppression or an instrument of repression, a pressure to change or an investment in not doing so. At times, irritatingly, it can seem to be both at once, simultaneously the opening and the greatest obstacle to transformation. My next section, which is actually going to be the bulk of this paper, is called Interminable Resistance, or How to Avoid Talking About Hegel. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud defines resistance capaciously as, I'm quoting, anything that interrupts the progress of analysis. That's actually Strachey's rather telling translation. Was immer die Fortsetzung der Arbeit stört, ist ein Widerstand, says Freud. So more precisely translated, whatever impedes the work or work, whatever impedes the work or work from proceeding, fortsetzen, from keeping on going, is a resistance. Freud sets the bar pretty low. To speak teleologically of thwarted progress, to set the measure of productivity, or even to define the direction, goal, or orientation of the treatment, is already to beg the question. Freud is here talking about the bare minimum of momentum, persistence in its barest, possibly even most Beckettian sense, keeping on going onward. Can we even say going forward? Fortsetzung. Resistance is what breaks the rhythm and sheer continuance of what Freud calls the work, the repetitive accumulating scansion from month to month, from session to session, from moment to moment, from word to word. It's a kind of general strike. Anything that interrupts the continuation of the work or of work is a resistance. And Freud, I think, means anything literally. I mean, he will not decide for us who the subject or agent of resistance is. In a very provocative footnote, he raises the inevitable objection. What about when things actually interfere with analysis? What about when there's wars and your father dies and things happen and you just can't come in and your mind's not on it? And he does not a priori exclude these real things from being resistances. I mean, which says, first of all, the location of resistance is uncertain. The agent of the subject of psychoanalysis is actually uncertain in its location, but also resistance is not a thing. It's not an inherent substance. Let's just say it's all what we make of it. So this pretty well covers everything: quitting, missed appointments, wasted appointments, lateness, forgetting between appointments, stalling over procedure, complaining about the schedule or the fees or the furniture, distracting the analyst with your alluring charm or with your annoying personality, doubt, dissent, disagreement, obstinate stupidity, excessive knowingness. You're going to have to bear with me, this goes on. Quibbling over interpretations, acquiescing too readily interpretations, but only so as to forestall discussion, assenting sincerely, even with conviction, but in such a way that the idea is somehow quarantined from further association, assenting to interpretations, but as if somehow through a dusty cloud of memory, the so-called, what Freud will call in French, fausse reconnaissance, so false memory syndrome, false recognition, whereby you're able to recognize the truth, sort of, but somehow keep it sealed off in the museum of the forever distant past, as if it were written in a foreign language, untouchable, unalterable, like a mummy. Assenting to interpretations while remaining stubbornly impervious to their implications. Assenting to interpretations, but in the mode of fetishistic splitting or disavowal. Je sais bien, mais quand même, I know very well that this is true, but nevertheless, I'll continue to believe and to organize my entire life as if the very opposite is the case. Preempting the analyst's interpretations by coming up with them first. Cheating analysis by doing it on your own. Over-preparing for sessions. Assiduously writing down your dreams every morning instead of simply remembering them poorly, patchily, the way regular people do. Doing too much extra reading. Diluting the experience of analysis by talking about it all the time with your friends and family, shadowboxing over theoretical minutiae in order to prove your intellectual superiority, offering up theoretical subtleties to flatter the analyst's acuity and to establish your own professional collegiality, refusing to get better, either so as to prove the analyst's incompetence or to demonstrate the uselessness of psychoanalysis in general, which is a classic, which was for Sartre's classic example of bad faith. Like you go to analysis precisely for the purpose of showing that it won't work, at least not on you. Getting better too quickly so as to prove the analyst's, and it, analysis's irrelevance, clinging to symptoms to display the profundity of your suffering, to draw moral capital, or simply to get out of doing the dishes, miraculously shedding these symptoms so that you get to quit analysis earlier. And then there are the dreams. You start producing dreams that seem custom-made to prove the analyst wrong. For example, dreams so manifestly unpleasant, so contra-purposive, seemingly designed to thwart all conceivable wishes, that their only possible purpose could be to refute the psychoanalytic theory of wish fulfillment, the dream as the fulfillment of a wish. Or you come up with dreams that seem designed to prove the analyst right, but only in a kind of inane and vulgar, all-knowing way. Dreams lifted straight from the textbook, bursting with prefabricated symbols, cigars, stairways, rotundas, trains, frozen ciphers drawn from the cultural repertoire, wearing their meaning on their sleeve, preloaded with ready-made allegorical significance and requiring no special hermeneutic expertise for their decoding, written in a language that pre-exists the dreamer and seems to belong to everyone, so painfully obvious that anyone can offer up the correct interpretation immediately and without any assistance. Those last three words were Freud's, by the way. Or you dream up dreams so dense with autobiographical significance, so knotted with illusion, and so deliriously rich in unique associative pathways, tendrils interwoven and sprouting off in so many directions that they're impossible to disentangle or literally analyze, to unpick or untie. This is, of course, the famous, much admired navel of the dream. Elements that seem written in a private language from which even the speaker herself is excluded and simply defy commentary altogether. Let me just dwell for a moment on these last two examples, the dream symbol and the dream navel. They're not usually spoken of in the same breath. In fact, following a cue from Freud, the symbol is hardly discussed at all, while the so-called navel is typically more appreciated and adored by Freud's readers than actually systematically explored. But together they're intriguing in that they each present a limit case to analysis, a kind of resistance to analysis that seems impersonal and unmotivated, a structural blockage rather than one serving any particular personal or defensive purpose. Their contrast is also dialectically suggestive. The symbol is, the Freud devotes a large chapter to dream symbolism, which he kind of dismisses as being stupid, the way old dream interpretation used to be. You have the textbook, you can read off this means this means this, and he actually puts hundreds of pages listing precisely these symbols, while declaring them to be not really that interesting to analysis. So the symbol is too universal to be informative. It means the same thing for everyone all the time. You see a staircase, and that means sex. You see a rotunda, and that means womb. You see a long, pointy thing. So that's the symbol. The symbol is too universal to be informative. The navel, on the other hand, is too idiomatic to be understood. So we have either an empty Esperanto or a blind idiolect, either too public or too private, either too transparent or too opaque. Combined, they represent the outer limits of intelligibility and stake out the obstacle course through which every analysis must wend its way. So I just want to kind of flag that, and I'm going to come back to this point in a couple minutes. Resistance is the stagnant dead time accumulating within and between sessions, the Sisyphean cycle of obstinate regressions, false remissions, idle precipitations, the repetitive recycling of the same material, boring the analyst and yourself with endless reiterations of the same complaint, or, which amounts to about the same thing, fascinating the analyst and yourself with manic efforts to fill the time with entertaining anecdotes amazing theories or penetrating observations. It's about the breakdown or atomization of time, unmodified by intervening history, removed from circulation. The past intrudes as a static, isolated remnant. Unconscious repetition takes the place of conscious memory, and the present evaporates from view. Or, which might amount to the same, it's the present which impinges. Everything is happening here and now, as if there were nothing and no one outside the room, no time outside the session, only the infinitely dilated now, a frozen, isolated moment without antecedent or aftermath, filling infinitely to fill all time. That's basically the definition of the transference. Depending on which way you look at it, it's either pure past or pure present, but it severs the connection between them. Above all, resistance is the breakdown in language, when the chain of association comes to a halt or never gets off the ground, when nothing comes to mind, when speech fails to spark, where despite or because of your best or worst efforts, the whole thing sputters and stalls and goes off the rails, or when fleeing silence, you fill the air with stories, or by concocting theories about language's own inevitable failure. It's tempting, and we usually do, think of resistance simply as a failure of productivity. The work gets interrupted because the analysand goes on strike, stops talking, stops generating material, what's always called material for analysis. But it's important to see that resistance can also take the form of a crisis of overproduction. There's an endless proliferation of material that keeps forestalling every possible resolution and then just kind of gets stockpiled as this burden that you never have time to get through. Every interpretation generates new material to work through, including the vicissitudes of resistance itself. Either way, the analysis gets mired down in a search for resolution that's either preempted or kept dangling forever out of reach. Resistance is thus the refusal or inability to obey the fundamental rule or the ground rule of analysis, that oxymoronic, impossible injunction, a double bind that inaugurates the analytic contract by constraining or forcing you to speak freely, to communicate whatever comes to or falls into the mind without selection, omission, evaluation, or concern for connection, sequence, propriety, or relevance. Like a passenger on a train, that's Freud's own somewhat Proustian analogy. You're to report the passing mental scenery as it passes by, merely looking on, like Hegel's phenomenological observer, or even like Husserl's suspending judgment and leaving understanding and explanation to another day, another person, another you. Free association is not a matter of self-expression or catharsis. The point is not to alleviate tension, to discharge pressure, or to tap into an archaic anarchic stew of primary process ideation. In fact, the apparent spontaneity of so-called stream of consciousness can be yet another stalling tactic, avoiding the abyss by plugging the void with noise. The goal of the free association method is not to achieve freedom or to express freedom in any immediate or obvious way, and certainly not in the sense of autonomy, free will, or self-expression or affirmation. It's rather about suspending the official rules of conversation, but only so as to allow the real constraints to reveal themselves in their unembellished tyranny. The aptly named chain of signifiers is anything but uncoerced. Okay. These examples are all drawn or extrapolated from Freud's own case histories, from Dora's defiance to Wolfman's strange compliance, including the snippets of Freud's own self-analysis in the interpretation of dreams and elsewhere. My point in going through this rather large laundry list is simply to underline the protean versatility of resistance, its inextinguishable inventiveness, the endless shuffling from negation to affirmation, until the distinction itself becomes unclear. Every denial can mask an affirmation. Every acquiescence can veil a secret repudiation. The apparent comedy of the exercise shouldn't blind us to the seriousness of the stakes. That's a lot of work to get out of work. I don't know if sloth quite covers it, actually, what Freud's talking about. And a lot of energy and ingenuity invested in prolonging suffering. The inventory doesn't begin to exhaust the repertoire of evasions, obfuscations, and prevarications that block the pathway of associations and interrupt the continuation of what Freud will continue to the end to call the analytic work. At one point, Freud, it must be said somewhat half-heartedly, I think, tries to classify the resistances topographically and according to the degree of explicitness with a view to dividing and conquering. The whole vocabulary of resistance in Freud is military from the outset. Although as its catalog accumulates, the obstacles take on an increasingly molecular form, becoming ubiquitous, protean, and directionless, less an organized army fighting on a unified front than a ragged and dispersed troop of guerrilla warriors launching their bombs and barricades unpredictably, haphazardly, and from everywhere. And the prospects of mounting a successful counter-resistance seem to dwindle. They're the explicit refusals of the ego as an agency supposedly motivated by strategic considerations of self-defense, the need to maintain repression, the inhibiting and distracting effects of the transference. It's like so embarrassing to say all these things. An almost rational investment in the secondary gains of illness itself. There's the purposeless, unmotivated obstinacy of the id in its timelessness and incorrigibility. It is, by definition, structurally impervious to modification, so it resists, it blocks. And finally, most unfathomably and most intractably, there's the ferocity of a superego, hell-bent on ruining everything, ripping up achievements, undoing or reversing progress, undermining therapeutic alliances, administering punishment, not so much for the purpose of discharging guilt or as deterrent or object lesson or for any other reason, but for the sole purpose of provoking even more guilt, Kafka style. Punishing in order to be able to administer even more punishment, inflicting suffering for the sake of suffering, prolonging illness for the sole purpose of prolonging illness, no special benefits attached to that illness, a kind of pure, disinterested unpleasure in a quasi-Kantian sense. And there are also the ever-expanding social and institutional barriers. I am drawing to a close this section. The panoply of resistances to psychoanalysis in the broader cultural arena, medical, religious, scientific, which Freud will describe, again, in consistently military terms, a beleaguered garrison, a fortified enclave, a frontier outpost, and which, like the individual resistances and reinforcing these, run the gamut: suspicion, ridicule, embarrassment, scientific incredulity, intellectual irritation, professional jealousy, moral outrage. But resistance to analysis can equally and even more annoyingly manifest itself as a disturbing absence of resistance, disingenuous credulity, vulgar pragmatism, stupid optimism, thinking it's going to make you better, for example. The traits that Freud found most annoying about America, as it happens, the place where psychoanalysis seemed to be most easily assimilated, provoking least surprise or outrage, and where he consequently saw the whole project to be on shakiest ground. He notes that the apparent tolerance of the Americans betrays a fundamental absence of engagement. Like the labile libidinal types whose excessively mobile, thin, wandering libido prevents attachments from adhering or from even forming, their whole existence is a slippery surface on which nothing sticks. And above all, as psychoanalysis acquires cultural currency, resistance to psychoanalysis will increasingly come to focus on the very concept of resistance. Among the irritations induced by psychoanalysis, and vastly outstripping in its provocation the more obvious bombshells, infantile sexuality, incest, perversion, cannibalism, bestiality, murder, vastly outstripping all those shocking things, none is more irksome than the heavy-handed assurance with which psychoanalysis itself seems to court objections, rewriting its own vulnerability, its tendency to attract detractors as the signature of its greatest strength. My expectations were by no means disappointed, writes Freud, of his most recalcitrant patient, Dora, when this interpretation of mine was met by an emphatic negative. Every rejection can be construed as a tacit acquiescence, the very objection to a theory, proof positive of its veracity. I told you I'm backing my way into Hegel, if only because it demonstrates the speaker's investment in denying it. Negation is in this sense rhetorically a form of preterition. That's the device of saying without really saying. I'm not going to talk about that. The negative operator, no, providing a kind of invisibility cloak under which the inadmissible material can elude the censorship and thus enter consciousness unscathed. In stating not P, I allow P to be put into words, if only at the level of propositional content, but as such, because it's been reduced to propositional content, it's been reduced to empty formula, a pure énoncé, a pure said, immunized from every context of enunciation, and as such, both referentially and pragmatically opaque, as if suspended between a kind of quotation marks. Not P. I just sealed off P, in a kind of glass museum case. The more vehement the refusal, the more certainty the cogency of the intervention. It's not my mother. This kind of talk is, of course, precisely what contributes to the bad reputation of psychoanalysis as a science. Its seemingly flagrant disregard for normal protocols of proof and legitimation. Denying falsifiability, it lacks verifiability. A similar objection, interestingly, is made from the opposite end of the philosophical spectrum, notably by critics like Foucault or Deleuze, who will deride Freudian negativity on strangely compatible grounds, although for opposite reasons. Obviously, this is precisely the kind of indignation that Hegel has always provoked so well. The dialectical machinery always waiting in the wings, parrying every possible resistance in advance, anticipating and reinscribing every possible objection as its very own invention. But Freud is, of course, being deliberately outrageous. We've just seen that negation comes in all shapes and sizes. When he said that there is no no in the unconscious, that the unconscious knows no, that is precisely because there is no one no to know. It's not a thing. It has no consistency or determinacy. Each time you say it, it's modulated by the infinite contingent variabilities of inflection, tone, mood, syntax, and context. It runs the gamut: denial, refusal, disagreement, aversion, excitement, agreement, desire, admission, fear, evasion, confusion, hallucinatory occlusion, and foreclosure. This is because no is neither a stable lexical unit, like a word that has a dictionary meaning, nor a formal operator, a formal grammatical operator that simply works, therefore automatically guaranteeing the conveyance of forbidden content. It's a shifter. It's an indexical or performative category in a very precise no. Sometimes it's not my mother. Can be a decoy to get the analyst off the track, a way of really saying, it's not my father, meaning it's my father, and so on. It's like the Jewish joke, you say you're getting off the train at Vienna only to trick everybody so that they're so surprised when you get off at Vienna, because you couldn't possibly have meant that. In fact, by the time Freud writes his essay, that's Freud's Jewish joke. Yeah. By the time Freud writes his essay on negation, it's not my mother has already become a kind of codified, sealed off bit of lexical information, the equivalent of having a cigar in a dream. And therefore, like all language has started to function wildly in the sense of wild psychoanalysis, which I'm going to get to in a minute. That is, say, a piece of frozen theoretical information rather than something doing actually any work. Peeling away the negation as if it were a price tag. You say it's not my mother, so you just remove the not, and you've got the constitutive truth of the statement. Does not in itself, says Freud, lift or overcome. Freud actually uses the rather charged for us word, aufheben, does not overcome or sublate the repression, just as lifting repression in turn does not automatically remove the symptom, and just as naming the resistance does not dispel it. On the contrary, as we've just seen, it can even provoke more resistance and therefore congeal that very resistance. This is because truth is not, as Hegel puts it, is not a freshly minted coin. It's a question not of propositional correctness, but of performative validity. It's not a lump of theoretical positivity, truth that is, but a practical result. This is why intellectual recognition or acceptance of the truth is irrelevant to its affective and therapeutic cogency. Even the analysand's more than intellectual conviction, not just the theoretical assent, but the actual conviction, what he thinks is a conviction of the accuracy of a given interpretation, may have no bearing on its analytic efficacy. The wolfman will relapse almost immediately, despite having unhesitatingly and unambiguously endorsed Freud's intervention, and will end up, in fact, spending the remaining decades of his life in virtually uninterrupted therapy. This is because any content that can be presented at the constative or theoretical level, dissociated from the situation process of analysis itself, can only function as an extraneous piece of information, a blind bit of pre-critical, coercive positivity, and thus be tantamount to a suggestion. Strictly speaking, a piece of wild analysis, something just brought in from the outside and plugged in without reference to the actual enunciative occasion. And thus a subjection of the analysand to the blind authority of the analyst, or of analysis, qua sujet supposé savoir, which is another way of saying that every sentence in analysis must shed its propositional appearance and become a kind of speculative sentence. The hitch is that there is no performative that cannot in turn be reduced to a constitutive. Even naming the transference, that is to say, highlighting the performativity of the performance, can become in turn a kind of propositional, a bit of propositional knowledge that you can therefore gets mobilized in order to continue or prolong the transference. By the time Freud writes his essay on negation, he's officially stopped treating resistance as an obstacle to be removed through suggestion, coercion, or argument, whether through hypnosis, by a laying on of hands, what he had called the pressure technique, which he literally used in the second phase of psychoanalysis just to get those memories out, by the priestly power of charisma, or by force of intellectual suasion or persuasion. This is basically because the agenda of psychoanalysis has shifted from a hermeneutic of unveiling to a pragmatics of working through. It's no longer simply a question of undoing repression, bringing the unconscious into consciousness or dissipating illusion, but rather about examining the ongoing investments that make any such undoing either impossible or ineffective, or both. Resistance is therefore not simply or even mainly a resistance to the lifting of repression. It cannot be cleared away like a roadblock or dissipated like a misty illusion, but is rather a resistance to the figure of the analyst himself or herself and to the figure of analysis itself, personified as a kind of thing. That is a mode of transference, which is why the whole model of consciousness raising, or Aufklärung, will by the end of the day have become inadequate. This is why the issue of tact, of timing, punctuation, performance will become all important, but also why time itself will become the killer. I want to return to Freud's early discussion of the dream symbol and the dream navel. Taken together, before eking out it just a tiny little bit on Hegel directly, taken together, these two instances stake out the outer limits of interpretation and bring time and history startlingly and unpredictably into play. Resistance to interpretation here seems to oscillate between the two extremes of impossibility and redundancy. On the one hand, the navel, there's an excessive opacity that blocks interpretation. On the other hand, the symbol, an excessive transparency that makes interpretation superfluous. On the one hand, the dream is bristling with idiomatic meaning, a knot of tendrils reaching ever deeper into the unknowable. On the other hand, the dream is coated with a kind of Teflon, like a veneer of socially acquired significance. Its elements pilfered from the public domain, allegorically frozen and predigested. All you have to do is look them up in the book and you'll know exactly what they mean. It's either so thick, in other words, that it's closed to further penetration, or so thin there's nothing left to penetrate. Either all murky depth or all shiny surface, the dream repels interpretation at both ends, either by refusing exegesis or by offering up its own elucidation in such a way as to preempt all further investigation. The navel is the magical detail that crystallizes everything, but only for the individual dreamer, and only at the point of dreaming. It knots together the entire network of associations, but so tightly that it becomes inaccessible to every observer, including even to the dreamer herself, at least by the next morning. Shared by no one, it escapes not even by the dreamer herself. Shared by no one, it escapes intelligibility altogether. The dream symbol is the breakaway detail that escapes the let's just call it the semantic holism of the dream. A product of the collective patrimony, it can be explained without reference to the unique network of association. Just lift it out and look at it, look up in the book what it means, and there you've got it. So it can be explained without reference to the unique network of associations that's produced by the individual dreamer, and that's peculiar to his idiolect alone. Shared by everyone, it reveals nothing about anyone. And that's why I think it's a form of resistance. Either there's too much to interpret or there's nothing. In both cases, the standard archaeological model, which Freud himself frequently invites, interpretation as excavation, as elucidation, uncovering, or unveiling. In both cases, the archaeological model is rendered ineffective. There can be no mediation between depth and surface because it's either all depth or all surface. Everything is either too obscure or too obvious, either too hidden or too exposed. The act of interpretation is either thwarted or preempted. These extremes mark the outer limits of analysis, but also expose its intractably social and political stakes. The whole thing takes place along the shifting continuum of privacy and publicity, between the two extremes or abstractions of individuality and collectivity, between the I and the we, just to cut to the chase a little bit here. There's also a crucial temporal dimension. Interpretation either takes too long, that is forever, or it doesn't take nearly long enough. It's as if everything is happening in the limbo staked out by the two poles of interminable or endless, infinite analysis and what Freud calls wild analysis, between an analysis mired down in the thicket of endless hermeneutic hesitation, an analysis that keeps racing ahead of itself to the finish line, between sluggishness and haste, between obsessional deferral and hysterical precipitation. So I want to make a case here, because we tend to always talk about resistance as a stuckness or manifest slowing down or a not moving. But what I'm suggesting here, and what I think what my preliminary remarks on stasis we're pointing to, is that haste too can be a form of resistance. It can be actually a form of slowing down that masks itself as impatience. The desire to get to the end is precisely a way of ensuring that you're stuck. So between obsessional deferral, I called it, and hysterical precipitation, you can't get to the end because the pathway is cluttered with obstacles and you can't cut through the tangle of interpretive possibilities. That's the navel. Or you can't get to the end because you've already overreached it. You can't cut the umbilical cord. Like Tristram Shandy, you can't get born. Analysis is stillborn or continually short-circuiting. Or you miss the end. Like Hunter Gracchus, you can't die. The moment of conclusion is somehow overleapt by having been anticipated, by already knowing how it's going to turn out. Either way, you can't terminate. Either you never get there, or you've already got there. And in any case, the very fantasy of the there will prove to have been the ultimate impediment to reaching it. This brings us to the central paradox of psychoanalysis, which also, I'm going to suggest, happens to be the paradox of the dialectic. On the one hand, resistance is the fundamental obstacle to analysis. With their incessant diversions and prevarications, the resistances to analysis are always on the verge of derailing it forever. On the other hand, without resistance, without delay, there'd be nothing but wild analysis. Any truth that presents itself without impediment immediately is, for this reason, only an empty abstraction, pure meaning without historical context, theory without the means of mobilizing it. The paradox is that meaning must be postponed in order to be enacted, which means judgment must be deferred. Every decision about truth and relevance and meaning, actually, must be suspended, which is another way of describing what the so-called free association method is all about. And yet at the same time, meaning must be presumptively assumed, even that there's going to be one. There's a point at which every analysis has to threaten to turn into a wild analysis. It has to get ahead of itself, if only in order to get started. And there's a point at which every analysis threatens to become interminable. It lags forever behind its own presuppositions, and those are the two dilemmas, the two poles of the dilemma, which I believe Hegel is staging so sneakily in the preface and the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. So I'm conveniently almost out of time, so I'm going to just cut to the chase and say very few words about Hegel. Very few words, but this is to invite discussion. At least in its formal structure, if not in its details, the contrast between interminable and wild analysis corresponds to what Hegel identifies at the very outset of the phenomenology as the two inevitable temptations to be avoided, ultimately the two resistances to be resisted, as the project of speculative philosophy gets off the ground. Either the work never gets started, or the work gets finished all too soon. These are two sides of the same coin, which for Hegel define the outer limits of German idealism as it's just come down to him. The evil twins, roughly speaking, and Hegel's speaking roughly, and I'm speaking roughly on his behalf, of Kant and Schelling, so don't get mad here. The tepid waters of endless critical reflection versus the skyrockets of intuition or rapturous revelation. The bad infinite of endless postponement versus the bad finite, which is obviously the same thing, of instant gratification. Obsessional deferral versus hysterical precipitation. Delay versus haste. This last antithesis evokes the antinomy of the master-slave. Either everything has to be consumed immediately without deferral, and the meal is over before it's even started, or the preparations take forever, the menu replaces the meal, and nothing is ever consumed. And usually, it's both at once. On the one hand, there's what Hegel calls the natural tendency to procrastinate, to delay the beginning, to pile on the obstacles, the production of endless make-work projects to avoid the hard labor, the real labor of the concept, sharpening your pencils, reading the instruction manuals, the endless propedeutic prep work that will culminate in Kant's critical philosophy with its obsessional need to inspect the apparatus, to check the equipment, to make sure everything is in working order, brakes and safety features installed so that you don't overstrain the engine or veer out of control and end up crashing on the rocks of the antinomies. Such hesitancy is not confined to the beginning, or rather, since Hegel will have established that since strictly speaking either or both no moment or every moment is a beginning, the work can get stalled at each and every moment, and typically does. Every impasse becomes an obstacle to continuation. Every transition has the unpredictability and arbitrariness of a pure ex nihilo beginning. The hiatus between the moments or stages becomes unbridgeable. Each individual shape is always on the verge of becoming frozen and insisted, disconnected from its antecedent and reluctant to go further, which is why it's so almost unavoidable that each section, each shape gets, each chapter, subchapter gets kind of fetishized and reified and becomes a sort of self-autonomous circle. I mean, the circle of circles also is pointing to the fact that every moment becomes a fragment in an almost romantic sense. It becomes a little hedgehog sort of hedging off its environment and repelling all connection, which is why, people always complain about the connection, the transitions. How does he get from one chapter to another, like the supposed seeming arbitrariness of the next step. It doesn't flow from what's preceded. So each individual shape becomes disconnected from its antecedent and reluctant to go further. The dialectical and narrative glue patchy and even missing. On the other hand, there's the just as natural tendency to precipitation or abbreviation. We seek the royal road of instant gratification. We grab for results, rushing to the end, wanting the result in its unprepared, unmediated instantaneity, like a reader rushing to the last chapter or wanting everything summarized in one concentrated aphoristic birth. The true is the whole, God is the absolute, not only substance, but also subject, and so on. Everything compressed into one instantaneous abridgment that you can have, that you can take without delay. So what I'm saying is that it's this, I've presented it as this kind of in very undialectical fashion, as this Scylla and Charybdis of, excessive hasten, excessive whatever the opposite is, delay. But I think what Hegel is showing, and that's why his book works or doesn't work the way it does, is that these are not simply two sides of the same coin. They are simultaneous. So to learn to speak philosophically or to do philosophy or to read philosophically, it is effectively like driving with both the brake and the accelerator on at once. This is one way of understanding resistance at the level of grammar, at the level of the sentence. Philosophical language is itself an encounter with the obstacle of grammatical form, which it's once rushing through and past, and at the same time constantly impeded by. So this is a sudden choking of speech, which is thought's own recoil at its own precipitation or haste. Every sentence is thus, this is how Hegel's training us to read, I think, is a struggle against resistance, not so much the resistance of the facts or the pressure of dogma or opinion, but the blockage within language against language's own illusory momentum. As the movement of predication is reversed, the grammatical flow turned back, the fluency of thinking interrupting. So that's why I think speaking philosophically or reading philosophically is basically having both pedals on or down at the same time. It's dashing against the same wall again and again, digging the same hole, like a stuck record forever repeating. Okay, just a couple more things. In his introduction to the phenomenology, Hegel underscores the essentially phobic structure of consciousness, the critical fear of error, concealing an ultimate fear of truth, the truth being ultimately the story. Did I just say story? The necessity of infinite loss or abandonment, the relinquishment of positivity that will ultimately define absolute knowing. Sacrifice, if you like. Absolute knowing is a kind of death we either try to postpone forever or leap ahead to just get it over with right away so we don't actually have to go through with it. To lose everything all at once, to cut to the end immediately, which would be Hegel's version of wild analysis, just to get the absolute right away, would be like dying all at once without mediation, which is impossible. So we do our dying in bits and pieces, hold off from getting to the end, get mired down in endless mediation. Or we try to discharge everything even before we have anything to discharge, to lose even before we don't have anything to lose, to die before we even, so precisely we don't have to die. The phenomenology is often read as a kind of Bildungsroman, the story of the progressive acquisition of insight regarding the world, one's place in it, and above all, regarding one's own normative commitments in securing that place, including, of course, the social conditions necessary for making and maintaining such commitments. As such, it's often read as a story of demystification or consciousness raising, the gradual overcoming of illusions or blind spots, the clearing away of impediments to rationality, including the new impediments constantly and inevitably generated in the course of overcoming previous impediments, and above all, those impediments generated by reason itself, the ultimate obstacle to enlightenment, turning out to be not the inscrutability of objects or the opacity of other people or the recalcitrance of the passions or the unruliness of the body, but the resistance mounted by reason itself to its own inexorable demands. And if you want the argument, just go to the chapter on faith and insight, and there's actually argument for why the phenomenology is not about enlightenment or consciousness raising or demystification or ideology critique or any of those things. In the phenomenology, Hegel rather unfortunately compares the pathway of consciousness to a ladder. but it's actually more like a game of snakes and ladders. You have that? You have that here. Yeah, okay. Where the snakes vastly outnumber the ladders, where at any point you find yourself getting sent back to the beginning, and the outcome is usually more a function of chance than skill. It's for this reason, and this reason alone, that the phenomenology is such a long book. It's a kind of anti-Bildungsroman. It's not so much that there's so much to do, so much to go through, so much wisdom to accumulate, so much to learn, so much experience to amass, so much richness to digest, that it takes forever to get through the story, although Hegel himself will, of course, talk that way. It's rather precisely because there will be so much to unlearn. Consciousness will need to collect experience, not for the sake of recollection, not in order to make memories so that it has a story to tell about itself, but precisely for the sake of having something to disremember or to dismember. So this is why, as Bart brought out really well, the phenomenology is a story not only of an unhalting or unstoppable progress or movement towards rationality, but also and above all, a story of the more and more ingenious ways of preempting, deflecting, or ignoring its own insights. What consciousness really proves to be good at is to be a virtuoso at forgetting what it learns, sense certainty, for example, diminishing its significance. This is basically perception. It's stuck with contradictions, and it tries to say it's not so bad because I can put a few buts and alsos and insofar as in there, just kind of keep the contradiction keep the poles of the contradiction from infecting each other as it is from the contradiction itself of infecting me. So it's kind of the grammatical strategy of responding to isolation in the Freudian sense. Disarming its impact or drawing inferences from its own experiences that can be counterintuitive and downright perverse. I mean, you have to go no further than the master-slave, and think about the slave's decision to become a Stoic, if that's his decision. That's not the most obvious inference to draw from what the experience should have taught him, and so on. So we could just like postpone the exercise of going through the whole phenomenology in textbook styles, as I did for Freud earlier, but just you get the point. What's unstoppable is the pressure of resistance itself, which proves to be anything but inert, or rather inertia, if that's what we want to call this principle of delay or drag, finds itself endlessly capable of reinventing itself, reassigning the very categories of motion and rest, redefining the terms of historicity as such. One of Hegel's greatest insights, and I think I'll stop here, is to show that the category of change is itself an empty abstraction, the very alibi for its own denial, while the resistance to change is itself not only an unstable and thus ever mutating or changing power, but may be the greatest force of transformation. In its avoidance of the new, consciousness shows itself to be a genius at innovation, if only in its ability to keep generating ever more inventive strategies of avoidance. Okay, thanks.